Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I'm so happy to present to you Kristina Fusella, who is the Director in Strategic Planning and Executive Support for Strategy and Rare Disease at Novo Nordisk. She is a purpose-driven commercial leader with a collaborative approach who relentlessly pursues excellence while advocating for innovation. And she joined Novo Nordisk in 2015 to be a pioneer in the disease state of obesity. She's moved across several commercial groups in that journey, and prior to Novo Nordisk, she had a generalist career in consulting at IBM and ZS if you're in the US, ZS if you're in Canada. Kristina has a passion for people and culture and has co-led the Millennials Employee Resource Group for 2 years. In addition to that, she is also working with women in Novo Nordisk Employee Research Group and partnering with the organization in ways to maximize women's potential at work. This is very exciting, Kristina. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
And I'm so honored to host you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you.
So why don't you give us a little bit of a personal intro, a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? Tell me about your family. What are your hobbies? A little bit about who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Queens, New York. I was born and raised there. I'm Chinese American. And I kind of have a classic, American dream, daughter of immigrants story. So my parents immigrated here from China, and they both were really hardworking, and they both had jobs while I was growing up. So the biggest impact for me has been my mom. She was always the breadwinner. Growing up, she was a real role model for me. And she always gave me the advice of having a practical career. And from woman to woman, I was an only child. It was really impactful. She said, never rely on somebody else to provide you an income. Never relying on the fact that you will have a husband who will work. Always make sure you have a practical career for yourself and be able to stand by yourself.
This is really similar to me because my mother also used to tell me the same thing. And so did my father. And so I think that always made a significant impact on me. And she also used to say, if you can, try to be your own boss.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
So that really made an impact on me. My parents were hardworking enough that we were able to move from Queens to Long Island to be in a better school district for me. And when I graduated from high school, I was able to go to Columbia University in New York City. And my dream was always to study astrophysics. I'm fascinated by the universe and by physics in general. When I got there, it was really quickly very, very technical, very academic, and very philosophical. Actually, that's what I enjoyed about it, and not quite practical. So I switched majors into engineering, kind of still hold astrophysics as a hobby, but I was studying engineering and I knew I always wanted to go into business. I wanted to graduate and not having had a major where I would need to get an extra degree, get a master's degree. I wanted to be able to graduate and have a practical career right out of the gate. So when I graduated Columbia, I wanted a breadth in experiences because I never really experienced anything. So I wanted to know, well, how do I know what I'm interested in? During my time as an undergrad, I was an intern at Credit Suisse. So that was my first world look into banking. Really wasn't a good fit for me. Then I joined IBM as a consultant, part of their out of college kind of recruit a lot of young, energetic people that you could rotate around and do a bunch of different things. So I was able to taste a lot of things, found pharmaceutical consulting really interesting. And I joined a company after IBM called ZS Associates. And what led me there was I quickly found that IBM was just so big of a company. There's so many people. I had no clue as to how I impacted the bottom line and what my contributions are. So I wanted a much smaller organization, and ZS was exactly that place. I did pharmaceutical consulting there for 2 years for Novo Nordisk and fell in love with Novo as a company. I would come on site and all the employees here were so welcoming. It's weird to say, but you could feel the culture.
You can. You can feel it in a few seconds when you walk into the building.
Exactly. And that's why I experienced. And I fell in love with it. So then there was an opportunity as Novo was first pioneering into the obesity space. People weren't quite sure whether to take a risk in their careers to jump into that new disease state for Novo. That opened up an opportunity for me to join here in the insights and analytics team. And as the people working on the obesity space, we learned so much about that world. It's a fascinating disease state, probably for another conversation. And in my career at Novo, I've been here for 8 years. I've always had a North Star of being well-rounded. Breadth has always been important to me since the beginning of my career. And instead of kind of focusing and perfecting one job, I wanted to try different things and jump to different groups to get a broader sense of the business, to be a well-rounded leader someday. And I've moved through a couple of different departments, and it led me really nicely to the role that I'm in now, which is essentially a chief of staff role for one of our executives. And that's been really impactful and fascinating to see all that goes into how do you become a leader in a company this large.
Yeah, very interesting. Mm-hmm. I have lots more questions to ask you, but I'm just really curious about how you got into the obesity space.
Absolutely. It was, well, first by happenstance, how I got into it. It was a job that was open and I wanted a foot in the door, and that was my foot in the door. And what I didn't realize what I was signing up for was this passionate journey that we had, that the team had started. And we were on this really moving tale as we listened to more patients and we heard their stories. There is so much bias and stigma in the world around obesity. I mean, right off how we label people with obesity, you often will hear people say, oh, that person is obese, an obese person. But when you think about any other disease state, you don't usually label someone with that disease. If someone has cancer, you don't say they're a cancerous person. That would sound ridiculous. That's a person dealing with cancer or dealing with Alzheimer's or dealing with epilepsy, For some reason, obesity, that's somehow tied to someone's identity. And that's an extremely important thing to tease out when you're looking at a disease state. It's the normal functioning of a body. It's your body protecting itself and doing the right thing. We were all cavemen, a million years ago. And if you lost weight, that was your body saying, oh no, that's a really bad thing. And there's hormones that activate in your body to prevent that. So it was a fascinating journey into how do you deprogram society and help these people realize that this mechanism and this disease is not their fault. It has nothing to do with their willpower and the fact that they couldn't exercise hard enough or they couldn't eat less enough. And there's so much more to that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to my usual questions and come back to the obesity question later. So can you describe a couple of incidents from your childhood or early adolescence that you believe formed you?
Yeah, sure. This is a really interesting question. I have 2 stories to share. So one is kind of my journey and my formative years of 2 socioeconomic worlds I lived in. So moving from Queens to Long Island, I have 2 stories there. The one I really like to reflect on was I went to Catholic school. The public school systems in New York are not the best. And my parents were able to get me to the local Catholic school. And for some reason, that Catholic school would have half days on Wednesdays. And my grandmother would always pick me up and we'd always go to eat lunch. And my grandmother, being a Chinese woman who did not speak English, she was obsessed with Burger King. She absolutely loved it. She needed it at least once a week. Otherwise, she would be visibly cranky. It was so funny.
That is hilarious.
That was our time to go to Burger King, was my grandma and I. And we would walk down 82nd Street in Jackson Heights, and there was a Burger King there. I think it still might be there. And there would always be a homeless man in front of that Burger King with his used cup begging for change. And I always took note of him because in Catholic school, you're taught to really take notice of giving money to the poor and helping others. So I would always notice him there. And then one day when we went there, he wasn't outside. I thought, gosh, where is he? When we ordered and sat down to our meal inside, and he was inside. He had actually sat down in the table next to us. And I remember him because I remember the smell, because he smelled so bad and it was very obvious. And I remember looking over at him in curiosity. I was about 10 years old, and he had just bought the smallest burger you could get on the menu and the smallest fry. And there was no drink. Like he couldn't get the whole combo, but he was able to get the two things. That's how much he was able to save. And he took a bite of his burger and the expression on his face was just happiness. It was like pure joy. And he just like, yes. And I thought, wow, the most mundane thing for me is I get to have this burger, fries, and a drink with my grandma every week. I would think nothing of it. And now that I reflect back, it always keeps me into perspective, keeps me grounded to really remember, sometimes there's things that we take for granted, but the things that we do, for some, that's like their dream to have. So that was one story. And then when we moved to Long Island, it was a bit of a culture shock because I went from a really diverse area, a lot of working class families in Queens, to a much wealthier area in Long Island. It was predominantly white. I think I might have been one or two Asian people in my entire school. And the culture of the whole area was very different. It was very safe. And I remember when we first moved there, my mom and I went to get Chinese takeout at the local store. And it's one of those where you walk in, it's just a counter. There's not really any seating. You just order and that's it. And there was a woman in front of us ordering, and she had her wallet out. It was like a 3-flap wallet. It was open wide out and her car keys on the counter. And she said, "Oh, I forgot something in my car." She left all their stuff out there and walked right out. I thought, wow, you could never do that in Queens. And that was so shocking to me at that time that the area is so safe and she had so much trust in all the people around that nothing would happen to her things. And that, again, always keeps me grounded in kind of the dual worlds, right? Being conscious of your surroundings, being conscious of privilege and what haves and have-nots are. So that's the two incidents from my childhood that really, I would say, keeps me grounded today.
Those are really great stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking about the homeless man who had the privilege of truly appreciating a burger.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have a privileged surrounding environment, but that deep appreciation of taking a bite of this burger and experiencing joy is a wealth that has stuck with you throughout your whole life. And the other woman had that privilege of being able to leave her things knowing they would be untouched when she came back. I mean, wouldn't we like the whole world to be like that?
Very true.
Cool. When you're growing up, you end up being in certain cultural groups. And the group is any group, basically, that establishes norms of behavior and expectations. So that can be ethnicity, language, religion, culture, secondary and tertiary ethnic cultures. And it can be much more than that, too. It can be hobbies and skills that you learn because there are groups of that. And it can just be friends that you've got. Your family's a culture, gender, age group. Everything's a culture, really, because everything has to do with belonging to a group in some way, shape, or form. Whether you feel like you belong in the center or on the edge or on the outside, you're still in reference to the group. So the groups that you were born into, what would you say has influenced your sense of culture and leadership now?
That's a great question. So when I reflect on my upbringing and when I reflect on your question, growing up, I've never seen myself as belonging to certain labels. And it was maybe the privilege of childhood, and moving around so much and never feeling I had a label. And I think the thing that impacted me the most was my immediate family, because that was the sense of culture that I knew and the way that my parents behaved. That was my world. And the thing that impacted me, I would say that I've brought a lot into my leadership style now, is watching my mom work and her journey growing up. So my mom is an immigrant and she had a huge language barrier. She was a Chinese woman. She had so much going against her as she entered an American corporate world. She came here for graduate school and then went into a government role, and talk about, a world of politics. And watching her grow in her career, despite all of the things that were working against her, it's kind of funny when I think about it. It was like she never even recognized that those were things working against her. And she never had any sort of self-limiting filter that sometimes we place on ourselves. And that really impacted me because she ended up achieving a lot in her career. She worked really hard. Another lesson that I take from her that she has told me is to always keep a work-life balance. She would go to work early and she'd stay in the office late. She wouldn't have dinner with me or my grandmother or my father. She would always come home after and have dinner separately, and I would sit with her. And then after that, she'd be back on her laptop or her computer and working again.
It was the opposite of work-life balance.
Exactly. And she ended up in such a very senior position at the end of her career before she retired. And when she did retire, she reflected to me and said, I really didn't need to work so hard. I would have always made it to that level. Maybe like a year or two later than she had, but she would have always gotten there. She was in her final role for about 10 years, but she would have rather spent more time at home because she thought, she went up to that point in her career, and at what cost? There was cost to never eating a good breakfast, taking care of your own health, spending time with family, things like that she really told me, as you think about your career going forward, always remember the things that really matter in life, the big things. So that, I would say, really impacted me as I was growing up, has kind of foundationally embedded itself into me as I journey through my career now.
Well, hard work and being rewarded for it is a myth. And there's a difference between striving for excellence and workaholism. And I think people rarely see the line between them. And they'll even say things like, it doesn't even feel like work. That's why I do it for 14 to 16 hours a day, because I love it so much. That's an addiction.
Yes, it's so true. And it's, one of these things that for a while, it was really romanticized in like American media.
It still is. Yeah.
Right. And I always think, why? I remember when I was in my first role at IBM, there was one week where I worked over 100 hours. Like I was able to bill over 100 hours. And that was a big thing. And I was bragging about it to people. And now I think about it, like, that was so stupid. What was that worth in my life and the impact that it had on me?
It might have been appropriate at the time. Mm-hmm. It's just not appropriate all the time.
Agree. It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I think where we run into problems is when we move into excess. When we're either in deficit or in excess, we move into problems. But
yes.
To take the road of moderation is different for each person, but it's hard to see it for yourself. You almost need someone else to point out to you that you're in excess or you're in deficit mode, because it's really easy to get blinded by your own ego, really.
It's very true. The thing about my mom that I think was really positive was this courage that she had always. And I think part of her reason why she worked so hard was nothing was ever given to her. Nothing was ever secure in the sense where she always needed a job. If she didn't have a job, then we'd have no money to pay for anything. But in her career, she almost approached it with blinders. She never had really any self-limiting beliefs. She never believed that there was a reason why she shouldn't say something in a room full of men or room full of senior people. And I saw that in her and I thought, gosh, that's really incredible, knowing that how much some people would limit themselves, being conscious of all of that. So it's something that I've taken to heart in my own career where, I have this North Star of wanting to be the leader of the future and taking on a kind of a non-linear career path, right? Taking huge leaps into different roles, super uncomfortable situations, because, when you're comfortable in a place, you don't want to change it. But without pushing yourself, there's really no growth. So that idea of, okay, knowing when it's okay to put on those blinders and not listen to the fear and not listen to the thing in your brain that's saying, hey, I think this is really scary. Are you sure you want to do this? And knowing the right leaps of faith to take. That's something that I don't believe it to be a cultural thing, but I think for my mom as a person, that's one thing that I believe she had that was pretty unique, that she was able to, that she really demonstrated for me.
Well, she showed courage, a lot of courage, and she kept the end goal in mind. So she was always aiming for that. And she was open to learning. She did what it took to learn something so that she could get to where she wanted to go. Those are all really, really wonderful qualities. And I'm sure that you have also embodied those qualities in your life.
I appreciate it.
It's still, though, the influence of an individual. You are influenced by being in an American culture. You have to be. You can't avoid it. You're influenced by some of the cultural beliefs and underpinnings of your grandparents. And most of us are not aware of that, especially because North America is the only individualistic, well, maybe Australia and New Zealand a bit, the only truly individualistic societies. Everything else is collectivist, meaning that people recognize that they're standing on the shoulders of giants. They recognize that their ancestors have brought them to where they are. And they notice that the things that they come from are not only just due to their own work, but also to the effects of many people. You can't even get a glass of water without thinking about all the people who allowed you to get water and the glass that you have and being in a place where you can drink it. we actually never accomplish anything alone. We're always surrounded by hundreds and even thousands of people that give us a platform for which to do each action that we do daily. So think deeper. How has American culture and how Chinese culture, and maybe if you were in a Catholic school, how did the Catholic school culture affect you?
It's true. I think even though my family, I think we're a little bit satellite from my massive Chinese family in China, right? And growing up, I didn't really have Chinese friends, or I really wasn't so much exposed to my own culture, but yet I hold so deeply some of the values that are really different, to your point, than the American culture. And I think a lot of that has to do with this idea of wanting harmony and this idea of being stronger together and being appreciative of earlier generations, and valuing the group versus valuing the individual.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely believe that. And I think a lot of what motivates me is I still have the mindset of our family is those underdogs that came to America with nothing, and I owe it to my family to be as successful as I possibly can, because that was what their hard work was for.
That's what they sacrificed for.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good for you. I love it when people can answer my question.
It goes back to the what we were talking about earlier with my story of the homeless man, right? Just being aware and appreciative and not taking things for granted. When I moved to Long Island and suddenly I was in a world where the kids I went to school with, a lot of them came from wealthy families, and a lot of them didn't care to work well in school or didn't try very hard. They would be actual stories of when they would crash their parents' Porsche into the garage because they put it on drive instead of reverse. And their parents said, "Oh, that's okay. We'll just get you a new one." And I thought, gosh, you don't even know how hard some people in the world would have to work to have what you have. And that's really a core driver for me. It's to always remember that everybody has their own journey. The world has large disparities in it. And one, to never take it for granted. And two, to always remember that and be inclusive of people and be trying to help.
Well, it must motivate you to want to do something about it, because when I was reading your bio, your work to lead a Millennials group, to open women's potential at work, to help people who deal with obesity, those are all a desire to help alleviate human suffering.
Yes. There are areas of opportunity everywhere. And sometimes, to me, it just takes a conversation for the person listening to want to listen and to actually listen and not make assumptions and be there.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first step.
True.
And to me, it's something that's so easy to do that I want to create more and more opportunities of those real connections for people to be able to share their story and for someone else to be able to listen to it and be impacted by it.
Me too. We have the same mission. So what about groups you chose to belong to? Are there professional groups, and what are some of those groups? One of the people that I spoke to, I had no idea he's a tech person, had a very strong interest in feral bees and helping to preserve local bee populations. And I was absolutely fascinated by this and how he got into that. And that has influenced how he does everything in his life now. So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So now tell me about you.
I was reflecting on what you said. It's really funny. This might be a funny answer about a group that I more recently have chosen to belong to, and that's actually women. And it's funny because obviously I'm born a woman, but growing up and all throughout school, I never had a lens that gender really mattered. And why does it matter if someone's a man or woman? I saw my mom be more successful than my father in her career. I saw clearly a gender role reversal there. And then I went to engineering school, and that's mostly men, but it didn't really matter. I was able to study, and the women in my class were able to do just as well. And same with consulting. It was a very fair organization that I joined where it was about your work output. So for me, in my lens growing up, I never actually cared about girl power or anything like that. So fast forward to Novo Nordisk, and last year I was asked to be the co-lead of our employee resource group, Women in Novo Nordisk. It's our largest one. It's got over 2,000 members in it. It's a really great leadership opportunity for me to be able to kind of stretch my wings as a leader. And I had to take a moment to think about it, because my first reaction was, could I really become passionate about this? And I thought, why does it matter if you're a woman or a man? Like, we have pretty well gender representation in leadership. What's the unmet need? Like, where's the burning platform here? And I had to really think about this. Later that year, I was asked to be part of a panel that we did internally. And someone asked me about kind of my story at a time when I had a barrier and, it was women that helped me. So I shared the story, after having my daughter last year, I dealt with, somewhat postpartum anxiety and postpartum depression. And it was a really hard time that I really wasn't expecting, because most of the media, I don't think I've ever saw, I've watched so many videos on YouTube and whatnot to prepare for my daughter coming into the world, but there was not one that actually mentioned, prepare for a time where you have to heal yourself. And by the way, this is something that will happen. And I was really taken aback. And it was women who reached out to me. There were women from all different random parts of my life. Someone I knew not too well, even in high school, that just reached out. And these people kept reaching out and asking, how are you doing? How are you handling this? I would share a little bit, and then they would share with me their story. And that really got me through that time in my life. And as I shared this story with more people in the organization after the end of the event, I can't tell you how many numerous number of women reached out to me and said, I went through the exact same thing. And we were just sharing stories. And I thought, oh my goodness, what an amazing group of people. I had a newfound appreciation for women. The amount of things that these women have gone through, I myself included, but they have gone through things that were even crazier, and they were managing so much outside of their work life. And yet when they come into the office, you would never know. They're really successful at work. They're on their game, and yet they're able to manage so much outside of work. And to me, that's when I realized, wow, it actually really matters. I thought women were amazing. Still, in our current societal context, women carry and juggle an enormous amount of responsibility between home and work, and they do so super successfully. And they still generally hold a large amount of private life responsibilities. So there was my burning platform. Like, if we want more women to succeed in the workplace, then there needs to be, one, more understanding and more accommodations made for women at work to successfully manage that balance. But two, I thought there is so much skill and strength and ability in being able to manage complexity and juggling all of that, that those are really amazing work skills.
They are.
Like, that you can look at and use to promote women and to get them to more senior positions. And even if they took like a 5-year gap to raise children, then they're back in the workplace and suddenly their time has been reset to T-5 and now they're trying to catch up. Like, that's not fair, because there's so much that they bring to the table.
Well, the game should not be a catch-up game, because men's careers typically move up gradually or suddenly, but they move up without interruption. I'm wondering, though, if when they're single fathers, if that's still the same case. However, for women, when they have a child, it's not that easy to just go back into the workforce. And I understand in the US, they have this ridiculously low amount of maternity leave. We have like a year in Canada, and there's, I think, 3 weeks or 6 weeks or something in the US, which is just biologically not good.
Yes.
So you've got women typically also bear the brunt of dealing with the childhood issues when they come up, and, having to be there when the child is ill and things like that. And so their careers are up and down, up and down, up and down, and they may never go all the way up. And so they're two parallel lines. They can't be viewed the same way. And that's where I think we're stuck, because what does success mean in a women's career should not be, oh, now I finally made it to catch up to some man who never had to go through any of this stuff. We haven't figured it out yet.
It's very true. And I think a lot of it has to do with, back to open conversations. I think when, we have created this world where the benchmark for success for women looks like they have to be superwoman. I look at any executive leader, and some were on that panel that I was speaking on, and you look at how they were able to grow so well in their career. And there were a lot of accommodations that had to be made at home. And that shouldn't be the norm. And when you think about the future, especially when I was leading the Millennials organization, both male and female people want to take equal responsibility sometimes in raising a child or being at home or being at work. So I think there's this wish, but I think there's also this idea of needing to create a psychological safe environment in the workplace where people can show up as their authentic selves and be able to show up and share, hey, this is a lot of things I'm carrying.
And not be penalized for it. I mean, I have a number of coaching clients who are women who, as soon as their company found out that they were pregnant, they managed to dismiss them. And it's a human rights ground that should not be allowed, but it happens over and over again. And nobody has any reprisals as a result. So it may look in the surface like things are similar in terms of equal access for women in the workplace, but it really isn't. You just have to scratch the surface and it jumps out to bite you, just like racism jumps out to bite you as soon as you scratch the surface. But let's move to the next question, which is your temperament and your personality. So, I mean, you're born with something that makes you uniquely you, that has to do with your temperament, and then you add on and that becomes your personality. So what would you say you were born with, and what's something you've added on?
It's a great question. So I think I was born with a strong sense of realism. And this is me reflecting back on my childhood. I was the kid, I never actually believed in Santa Claus. I never had a moment in my childhood where I believed that was real, because logically, mathematically, scientifically, how in the world would that be real? And so for me, I was always very real, hence why I became an engineer as well, right? It was very practical. And I think in that mindset, it's very easy for me to be able to look at a situation and plan forward something and see all the potential pitfalls and things that could go wrong. And that's one strength, but also it falls in the trap of being too negative. And I've also learned more recently in life, so this is kind of why I've added on, I truly fundamentally believe that each person manifests what they want in life. Mm-hmm. And I believe that positive energy is the faster way to achieving your goals than being in a negative space. And that mindset is really critical. So I work a lot in the diversity and inclusion space. I'm really passionate about it. And I think you could choose to live in kind of this defeatist mind where, all the cards are stacked against me and there's no way that I could succeed. So why bother even trying? Or you could see the obstacles and know that there is a way to work productively to go around them. So for me, it's been trying to actively change my mind in terms of my own self-limiting beliefs and knowing what I may instinctively limit myself in doing, imposter syndrome. And this story that I have is this idea around trained optimism. And optimism could be trained. So
of course it can. It's just a habit. It's a habit of thought.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. I was definitely born not an optimist. And it's something that you can kind of train yourself in doing. And to me, I think this is so powerful when you're able to balance both of them. I don't know if we have time, but I'd love to share this story around Sir Ernest Shackleton's voyage. So if, for those of you who don't know this story, I really recommend reading it at some point. So Sir Ernest Shackleton, he was a captain on about 100 years ago on the ship called Endurance. And the ship was essentially going to sail from England to Antarctica. And this 25-ish so crew was going to cross the Antarctica shelf on foot and then sail back home. As soon as they got to Antarctica, they hit an ice shelf and the ship was essentially shipwrecked. And the ship slowly sank over a couple of months. And there was no way that they would be able to get on that ship and go home, even turn around. So they were stuck on that in Antarctica for 2 years. So think about it, this was 100 years ago. Nobody expects them to come back, really. It was a really low probability of success mission. There's no way to reach anybody, to radio anybody. And what Sir Shackleton did in that moment when he saw was, okay, this is a very low chance of success that we would even get back alive. But he reinvented the new mission for his group. And that was, we are all going to make it home to England with no loss of life. And they did everything in their power to redirect and do that. And part of this journey was he had his team do optimism exercises every single day. And it was a super simple exercise. It was just 3 questions. And the 3 questions were, who is the first person you're going to embrace when you get home? What is the first meal you're going to have? And the last one was, what is the story that you're going to tell?
Wow, and those are great questions.
Right? I mean, so simple. You do this thought exercise. He did it every day. And that changed the mindset of everybody. And in the end, it was a success. They were able to reach home after 2 years alive, which is incredible. And there's so much to that story. I encourage, people to.
Wow. I have to read the whole thing now. I'm very curious.
Yeah, it was amazing. But optimism could be trained. And it was pretty powerful.
That is great. I love it. So a time when you experienced cultural shock and you thought, wow, the way I'm used to doing things is not the way other people do things. How did that happen?
Yeah. And this goes back to our last conversation earlier around being a Chinese American in the American culture. There's so many moments that this has happened. And I'll tell you a story of the most recent one. I did a bit of a research study with our employee resource group here that's for AAPI and people of the Asian diaspora. This research was essentially trying to listen to their voices. We have diversity aspirations as an organization. We believe that having diversity and having a truly inclusive culture here will lead us to financial success. Because it will help us better understand the patients that we serve in a much better way, just being able to have that inclusive mindset. And we truly believe that as an organization. So I was given license to do this research where we looked at our own employee group and saw that we don't see too many of AAPI descent elevate into leadership despite having a sizable population. And I was trying to understand why, what is that barrier and why isn't it happening despite our company having ambition for it to? The results of the research were really interesting. So there were about 20 interviews by a third party. It was totally anonymous and people really opened up. And there is absolutely this dynamic around the core Chinese, Asian cultural values. I say Chinese because I relate a lot to the Chinese ones, but these Asian values, and they are in direct opposite almost to some of the American values. So for example, we talked about earlier, we value harmony. In Asian culture, there's a lot of value to harmony, being humble. When you don't speak in a group, especially with elders, it's seen as maturity versus in generally in American culture, it's seen as you're not engaged. So growing up in school, I was always that kid who never really asked questions in school because I was really busy listening and listening deeply to learn. But the feedback from my teachers was always, she doesn't ask any questions. Why is she so quiet? I don't think she's engaged. And that's already like early on, such a different dynamic between the Asian values and the American culture.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of harmony versus American dynamism, challenging the status quo, being aggressive and being like really proud of your accomplishments and being really self-promoting are things that are seen as recipes for success in American work culture versus in Asian culture that people just think, why do I need to go brag about myself? I think my work should speak for itself. And this idea of just hard work pays off doesn't really add up fully in the American work culture.
Mm-hmm. Those are great examples. Those are really great examples. Let me ask you another question. What context brings out the best in you? So what would allow you to be your full and true self at work?
That's like the $1 million question, Marie.
What do you need to feel free to be who you are?
I think a culture of true psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to having an environment where people are valued for their individualism, valued for their differences, rather than wanting everyone to conform to a standard and a certain recipe for success.
Yeah, the interesting paradox is that when you allow people to be who they are in their most unique ways, they long to belong and contribute to the unity of thought to the organization. And when you try to get people to conform to some unified standard that you believe the organization represents, people drop out and can't contribute. So it's like unity and diversity.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way of putting it. It's the two tensions. And I think in the sense of having that tension right there between unity and diversity, that in itself is probably really positive.
It is. It's a universal law. Look at your body. You have one heart. You've got two eyes. You've got two hands and 2 feet, but then some things you just have one of. And all the body parts together work with unity towards whatever you wish to achieve. Just taking a step forward shows unity and diversity.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Let's go to your soapbox moment. What would you like to promote?
I would really love to see more investment put into these employee resource groups. I think they're so much more than people of different dimensions of diversity trying to get together for a social club. Sometimes I think they can be seen as a social club, but I think there's so much value to be invested into these groups because they help create that culture of inclusion that is so critically important for organizations. But the other thing I would say is that these groups are really great breeding ground for talent and future leaders. So, advancing inclusion with productive conversations is critically important. It's such a key skill to have. And when you think about the leader of the future and the types of people we would need, these people have essentially self-selected. They've raised their hand to say, I can manage without authority. I can rally a group of people together, aligned to a certain mission. And plus, they're able to practice their skills in such a safe sandbox environment too. So for me, I would say to people who are in organizations, I really encourage you to take a look at these employee resource groups if you have them. If not, maybe think about how do we invest in them. I think it would lead to positive cultural changes and then also business success.
That's great advice. Very good advice. Anything else you'd like to say?
This goes back to just reflecting my time at Novo. So I've been here for 8 years. I've had 8 managers in those 8 years, and I've had many more managers prior in consulting. And it wasn't by my own choice. Sometimes I wasn't jumping jobs every year by any means. Sometimes the managers would change or I'd be doing a rotation. And I thought I could write a book about leadership. And I was thinking about this. But really the secret at the end of the day, if I were to compare the worst managers and the best managers, the worst managers, I would say, make assumptions about people and they don't listen. And the best managers listen. And that is just the secret.
Love it. All about listening.
Really is.
Everything starts with that and ends with that. Kristina, I want to thank you for this lovely conversation that we had together and your thoughtful responses and your breadth of experience. It's been really, really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marie. It's really been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you for the thought-provoking questions and digging deeper. And it's really been an honor to have spent this time with you. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Have yourself a wonderful rest of the day.
You as well. Take care.
Bye-bye. Kristina Fusella has a career with breadth in a variety of disciplines, ranging from engineering to analytics and sales to strategy and rare disease director of Novo Nordisk, specializing in obesity research. From her childhood memories, she recalls developing an ability to see things from other people's perspectives. Eating at Burger King with her Chinese grandmother and becoming aware of homelessness and poverty was later juxtaposed with trying to find her place in a mostly white school surrounded by wealthy families. She was keenly aware of both the appreciation and joy of a homeless man mindfully savoring his small burger with the lack of awareness characterized by wealthy teens purposely crashing their father's expensive cars just because they could. Using the Chinese cultural gift of respectful listening and the American value of telling your story, she has created a career characterized by bringing diverse voices to the table and ensuring there are ears to hear them and hearts to respond. It was a pleasure to interview Kristina and to hear a few moments from her life. I really enjoyed her willingness to go deeper when faced with probing questions. Do take the time to share this episode with a friend, and remember to rate and review by going to our webpage, shiftworkplace.com/podcast. Thank you for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Want to show some appreciation? You can buy me a coffee. What? How do you buy a coffee for a podcast owner? Well, there's a way. Let me explain. You go to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. That's spelled MarieGervais. So it's buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. And when you go to that website, what's going to happen is you'll get a chance to click on 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 cups of coffee at $5 a piece to help contribute to the cost of the podcast. And yes, it's $5 for a cup of coffee because it's quality coffee for a quality podcast. So I hope you will contribute and you'll help us to reduce the costs of the podcast by going to buymeacoffee.com/Marie Gervais. Thank you in advance for your generous contribution.